Awesome. Hello, everybody. Hopefully you're having a good time. Are you all having a good time? Yeah? Yeah? Cool. You just got beard up. You had some grooves. Like, this is pretty cool. So this is my first time here, and I'm really excited to actually step foot outside of the airport of Dusseldorf. I've actually been in the airport on the way from Berlin to New York, and that's the only time I'd ever seen anything Dusseldorfy, so it's been cool to kind of actually experience outside. Pretty nice place. Cool, so today, before we talk about, designing socially impactful digital experiences, a little bit about myself. I'm a product designer at SoundCloud. I don't know if there are any Berliners in here or any SoundCloud fans, but that's what I do every day. I design products that help people kind of share sounds across the world, and it's super fun. I also work with Brooklyn Gamery, create games. I actually use Phaser, so fun times. It's a really fun, cool thing to use. JavaScript is fun. Additionally, I also work with Code Liberation, which is a group that teaches women how to program video games, and I make lots of things, random websites. I've helped to run a gaming tournament. I create games by myself, and I've also made comics and zines and other random stuff. So I just like making things that people can interact with or share experiences with each other through. So today we're going to talk about several different things. We're going to talk about technology. I'm going to cover, a little bit about how it's great, it's awesome, it's changed society for the better, right? I also want to talk about the way that we think about society and technology, and why the way we think about tech needs to change. So that's where the title kind of comes from, right? Designing for social good. How can we design things that help people? And I want to take you through a case study using a project that I created and give you tips for the things that you're working on, and hopefully this can be applied to your everyday work, whatever it may be. So some quick warnings. I'm wearing a very appropriate shirt for this talk because I'm going to be firing shots at the way that we think about technology. I'm trying basically to challenge the way that we think about things, to not just accept them as they are, but to kind of make sure we're questioning everything that we do and making sure that we're, doing a good job and really helping people. So figurative shots, not literal shots, because guns are illegal. So jumping in. Technology. As I mentioned, I wanted to explore technology, talk about how we think about it and how it affects our lives. So over the past century, technology has improved very quickly, right? Like, it is a part of almost all of our lives, like all the time. I use technology as soon as I get up in the morning. It wakes me up. It's with me when I'm actually in the shower. This thing here, it's all over the place. Now, just look at, for example, 8 gigabytes now, like the size of your fingernail, right? And back in 1956, that was 5 megabytes. Like, that thing that needed to be airlifted and could crush people was only 5 megabytes. So it's mind-blowing if you think about that alone, how much technology has changed and continued to shrink and, just slowly embedded itself in our lives. And it's changed many, many things for us, right? It's changed, like, travel, for example. How many of you flew here? Anyone? Yeah? Cool. So you've probably all taken a flight before. If you haven't taken a flight, you've probably been on a bus that has like an in-bus or in-flight television. That entertainment makes 8 hours, which is how long it took me to get here. It flew by very, very quickly. Additionally, things like self-driving cars, right? That is changing the way that we think about being on the road. And bullet trains are pretty darn cool. Additionally, communication. Just look at how smart and tiny these things are. You can do basically anything. I can send a text message from my watch, which is really cool. And that used to be things that we thought would happen in the far-off future, and now we're just doing it. So technology is improving so, so much. People don't even use the phone function anymore. I don't know about you, but I hardly ever call people. I text my mom. And also other things like healthcare, abilities, heart rate monitors, for example, are just one example of the ways that technology has helped us to be able to analyze people and help them even faster. You can manage your healthcare online, for example, and we're helping people, for example, amputees. They can do more with bionic hands and different kinds of things. So there have been many solutions that have helped us. And because it's helped so much, I think that people have begun to see it as sort of a solve for all. So if there's a problem that happens, people say, let's build something that'll fix that. Or they'll say, let's make a hackathon that is going to make that go away. But that doesn't always work so well, right? Technology can help, but It can't always solve problems by itself, or maybe it never does because we need people, right? Technology, especially the social good kind, relies on human interaction to work. So whether that's things like getting people to form habits, for example, or getting them to help each other and actually commit to doing these things, we actually need people to work or to have technology work. So why, if we know that people are necessary, do we think about tech sometimes as a silver bullet? I'd really like to focus on this for a second and kind of analyze this mentality, think a little bit about how it happened, and show some examples of how it can fail us, as well as talk about afterward how to design technology that will hopefully not induce this mentality, or how to design technology without using this mentality. So, firstly, we're problem solvers, right? Whether you're in tech or you're in games or you're in another field, you want to solve problems. You see these things happening to people. Part of why I became a user experience designer, for example, is that I really love helping people. I see people having problems. I want to figure out a way that I can make those problems go away. And we see problems happening, to ourselves that we want to fix. So building an app really quick, that solves a problem that someone else hasn't made yet. This is what we do as product designers, as developers, as creators. And, it makes us think, because of what we do, that technology can be applied to anything. And we're also a creative group of makers, and this is pretty much, for me at least, one of the only things I know how to do. It's a combination for a lot of people of some kind of design skills, development skills, engineering skills, task management kinds of things, all of those kinds of things together. Another thing, I don't know about you, but I've heard these multiple times within the time I've been in tech. Things like, people in tech are amongst the smartest in the world. We have also been told things like we're doing the best work of our lives, or things like we've got the power to make change happen. Actually, also as a 90s kid growing up in America, this is just a thing that everyone said, this is the future, we can make change together, and now is the time. But what happens when you combine this with makers sometimes is that it leads to an inflation of ego. We think we can do anything, right? We have the power to change people, and we have the power to change things. This is what people have told us. Combine that with instant gratification, which is the thing that, when I go on the internet, for example, I expect something to load now. So I have hotel internet at the moment, and 2G, which is just true suffering. And it's making me rethink how I kind of associate with technology and kind of realize, oh, this isn't how the rest of the world is. So instant gratification, you combine that with the other things where you think technology can happen now, you think that technology is amazing and that it can change people's lives and that you can do all these things. It really comes down to privilege in a way. Sorry to use a fun buzzword, but privilege, right? When I was using the internet in my hotel, I was my privilege was being challenged. I was so used to in America having LTE and having really fast internet all the time, being able to access things in seconds. But this made me realize that I forget sometimes that people don't always have equal access to technology. We also forget that people have different relationships in different places with technology. For example, some people use SMS more than other forms of interactions with their computers. A lot of cultures don't even use smartphones for various reasons. And we also forget sometimes that things don't always work well. So I don't know about you, but for a long time when I was starting out, I kept not thinking about error states or fail states or any of those kinds of things because I was very, very idealistic. And I think that's just another way that we kind of think about technology, is that it's going to go right and things are always going to go very well. And obviously not everyone is idealistic when they come into technology, and not everyone comes from the same background or has the same level of privilege. But in the USA, at least, technology is majorly white and majorly male, which means solutions are often focused on majorly white and male problems. So this combination of problem solving, ego, instant gratification, and privilege can have quite harmful consequences. So let me show you a few examples of when tech was expected to deliver a solution for people or solve a problem and maybe didn't do the best job it could have. So, social media. I am a huge fan of Twitter. I use it all the time. Social media connects people, right? When it catches on and people actually start using it all the time and it becomes a habit, it affects people's lives quite greatly. But again, it requires people to actually join it and use it. Twitter and Facebook are two very, very popular networks, right? You might have heard of the phrase hashtag activism. It's really, really great for awareness, actually. It does a great job at telling people that things are happening in the world that they should pay attention to. So two examples in the United States specifically are Occupy Wall Street and Black Lives Matter. Now, both of these started on social media and lived on social media for a while, and sometimes people still talk about them on social media. But these movements started to slowly move off of the internet and start gathering in real life because they realized as they got larger and larger that things became more disorganized and it was hard to manage. And so they needed to actually come together and meet in person to make things happen. Now, people started faulting the groups, especially Occupy Wall Street, that they didn't have tangible change, which again maybe goes back to the instant gratification expectations of technology. But they actually created a lot of momentum, right? So again, talking about awareness, and they actually led to parties in the United States discussing their issues at different things like democratic rallies and different things like that. So it did have an effect, but it was mostly around awareness. And the other thing to think about, especially with social media, is when countries actually block access for their citizens. So different places have actually said, no, you can't use Twitter, and that means that people can't actually use it to gather with each other. So that's one example. Another example is Project Loon by Google, which is very, very cool in theory, right? Like it's a hot air balloon that has really high-speed internet access, and they aim to actually help people in other countries, mainly in places like different continents like Africa and Asia, to have internet without having to install really, really, really expensive underground cables, like fiber cables and various cables like that. However, even though it's given people very fast internet, and it usually works pretty well, it does actually interfere with other frequencies, which wasn't something that was tested. And it also has crashed 8 times in the past 2 years, which provides a pretty large inconvenience for people. And so you can actually Google it, or there's a whole section on Wikipedia just specifically about Project Loon crashes. So the question here is, how many other options did they consider before settling on balloons? How much research did they do? And did they consider the inconveniences that would happen when the balloons actually failed? Another one is HealthKit. So Apple's HealthKit opened doors for people to track and share health data in a very, very new way. And the issue with this is that for a very, very long time, it didn't include the tracking of menstruation, which is what a large number of the population does, interestingly enough. And so people were very, very frustrated with this, and they later included it after a fair amount of outcry from people. But the interesting question to ask here is, was this something that the developer team considered? Why not? Why did people prioritize this? Who prioritized this? Was anyone there who menstruated, for example, that could say, hey, this is a feature that exists on the App Store that people obviously use and download all the time. Maybe we should include this. But it didn't, and it took a very long time for it to actually be integrated. So again, challenging assumptions, questioning who's actually making those decisions. Another one is homeless Wi-Fi hotspots. So I don't know if y'all have heard about this one, but fun, awkward, makes you definitely, it made me feel very weird, at least when I heard about it. So in Texas, this is where this started, and this is another internet sharing idea, right? So people said, hey, homeless people sell papers. That's cool. What if they were Wi-Fi hotspots? And so someone decided to run with it, right? And so what they did with this was like a marketing ploy. They donated some profits to charity. That didn't go over very well with people. People were kind of asking, why would you make homeless people Wi-Fi hotspots? Why would you make them stand there? And why would I be okay with, doing that to someone? So this happened one time, didn't go very well. Happened another time in Prague twice. And there was like an Indiegogo campaign attached to it. Didn't work out very well. And the questions here again are, did anyone ask, if consumers would feel comfortable with this? Did anyone ask if, the people who are the Wi-Fi hotspots are like, yes, I'm making money, but maybe they don't want to stand there all day, just kind of being there, being a Wi-Fi hotspot, unless they get to talk to people, which maybe might be nice. But moving on. Siri, and this is the final kind of example here that I have of this. So Siri isn't exactly social goodie per se, but it is something that people use every day, a lot of the time. I'm sure there are a lot of iPhone users in the audience. So it's an assistant of sorts, and if you read through these are quite uncomfortable. So you can set reminders for things, right? You can look for things nearby. Now, heavy content warning, these things are quite, some of these things are violent, and some of them are quite terrible. Now, before, when you looked up these things, like Siri, I want to sleep and never wake up, it would just tell you where a hotel was nearby. If you looked up, like, remind me to kill myself, it would just do that. And so it didn't have these kinds of things built in. People weren't thinking about technology as something that someone might use in this kind of case. And so these kinds of things had to be fixed later after the technology was already released. And the question there is, why didn't we think about this kind of stuff? Like, people could actually say this, and request resources through this kind of technology that they use all the time. So again, thinking about assumptions and how we kind of assume that technology will be used. So all in all, what I'm trying to say with this is that we really need to change the way that we're thinking about our technology. We need to be a little bit less idealistic and start to understand the place that technology sits within people's lives, not just our own, but also other people around us, because everyone has a different relationship with technology. So to quote a fun Google person, we all love technology. We all believe in its power, but technology is not a silver bullet answer to the world's problems. It generates awareness, it generates visibility, and it offers enormous opportunity. But people still affect society more than technology can do by itself. You still require people's interactions in order to implement technology, or the government, for example, can just choose, make a choice that renders technology inaccessible or ineffective. So instead of thinking of technology as something that alone changes the world or that has all of the world's solutions, perhaps think of it as something that helps people by augmenting their experiences. It can't solve all of our problems, but it can help solve or make the process faster if it's done well and has, a good solution. And instead of doing or treating small possibilities as edge cases, make sure to actually do your research and maybe see if there should be solutions included for those kinds of things. Really look at the edge cases that you've talked about and say, are these edge cases for me, or do I have information to actually back this up and prove that these are things that will never happen? And in some cases, especially with something like Siri, maybe it's a good idea to just have that in there anyway. So, with the idea of augmentation in mind, I decided to experiment. And I actually recently graduated from my master's degree, so this was actually my thesis project. And I decided to say, hey, can I see if I can create a project, a piece of technology that aims to augment people's experiences and speed up the rate of change. So the task I was trying to do here was to just make a project that affects the way that people think about and discuss an issue. Because as I mentioned, awareness, right? Technology is very, very good for these kinds of things, for sharing knowledge. So I decided to tackle sex education, which is a huge problem, very specifically in the United States, where this is from a movie, but people basically say this to children all the time. This is how we think about sex in the United States. And I don't think that's a good idea, and I'll explain why. So as I mentioned, sex ed in the US is quite terrible. It varies by state, actually. So certain states can teach in one way, while other states can teach in another way. The country doesn't have a unified way of teaching this kind of education, nor does it really any other form of education, which is also a whole other mess. So some states teach abstinence, which means just don't do it and it won't matter. And other states teach comprehensive education, which means how to protect yourself and how it works and how your organs work and all those kinds of fun things. But the issue with this is also that even if you have a comprehensive piece of curriculum, you still get taught this kind of thing. It's still quite negative, and we still basically say, avoid doing it because it's dangerous. But this is actually kind of bad because these are young people, right? They're going to grow up and turn into adults, and if they're thinking about it like this, they're going to keep thinking about it like that even when they're older and they're expected to do this stuff all the time. So how do we make sure that young people aren't making decisions about their bodies without actually knowing these kinds of things? And this is what I wanted to help change. So the question was, how can I do this without going through the education system, which is clearly a hot mess and needs a lot of help? I decided to start with some research because I had my own assumptions, but I really didn't want to stick to those. So first I looked at different books. I looked at some books about the history of education, about the history of sex education and sex in general, the perception. I also looked at research papers and tried to understand what people were doing. And I also looked at different curricula to see how we were teaching this education to people. And I learned a couple of things. It's much harder to actually unlearn something than to learn it. So preferably you want to reach people before the points are driven in too hard. You want to challenge it when they're learning it or right after they learn it. Also, a side note, negativity toward a subject, of course, makes it harder to research it, which means Americans are not getting funded to research these things, and we could be finding out a lot of interesting things about sexuality and sensuality if we had the funds for it. Additionally, the state of sex education, especially in the United States, is caused by various influences over centuries. So this isn't a new problem. Even though it was really easy for me to think, oh, this is happening right now, let's change it right now, this is something that is probably not going to be solved immediately and is going to require probably generations of change. So after that, I decided to also do some empirical research and try to understand how many people are using the internet to learn about this thing. How are they doing this? Like, are they just going through school? How do they actually feel about education in school? Is it as terrible as I think it is? And what do people want to learn about it? So I really tried to question the assumptions that I had made at the beginning of the project. So before deciding, yes, this is actually terrible, you know, in addition to the research that I had done before, I wanted to hear from some current voices. And so 160 people replied. And they said things like, yeah, there's like huge guilt issues that I felt, and it still affects me to this day, even though, you know, that was a while ago. And some people also said things like, I learned most of what I know from the internet, like I'd bypassed school, I bypassed my parents, and just Googled things because Google would tell me the answer. And other people said, it was just a joke, like it was a mess and it's terrible. So from this, I learned a couple of things and I decided to make some goals based on my learnings. I decided to reach people in college between the ages of 18 and 25. They're still learning things, they're still experimenting, they're solidifying their beliefs, right? And you might ask, well, why not teenagers, or why not preteens, or why not kids? Well, as I mentioned, they're experimenting, right? They're transitioning into adulthood. This is when the things that they are learning, they either say, yeah, that's true, or, yeah. The other thing about it is that if I target people in college, younger people might say, oh, that's cool, that's for older people. And this is a hypothesis, right? So this is something that I can challenge while I'm working on the project. And the other part of this was to make sure that the audience, whoever interacts with this, could use it to learn and experiment without real-world consequences. So at this point, you'll notice I haven't even said, well, what the heck am I going to use to make it? And that's because I really wanted to make sure to frame my project idea and fully solidify the goals before I actually said, well, this is the platform I'm using, or this is what I'm building it in. And once I actually defined those goals, that's when I said, all right, well, this could be really good for a phone game, because young people use phones quite often, and obviously that's an assumption, but I mean, everyone in here, I see phones on desks. So, quite true. We're using phones for so many things, and that goes back to the communication I talked about earlier. And in some cases, it's actually the only way that people are accessing the internet, especially when they're younger. You know, computers break. I remember when I was in college, some people had computers that were like 8 to 10 years old. That's just kind of how it was. So their phones were much more current and also a lot more personal. And it was also less likely that if some younger person accessed this, they wouldn't have to worry about their families looking through their phones as much. Like, I definitely know parents do observe what's on people's phones, but it's less likely than if they were to go on a computer and have to deal with parental controls and things like that. So I wanted to make sure that people could access this if they wanted to, because again, I didn't want to go through the education system, although it could happen. So then what I did was I did some competitive research because I wanted to understand the landscape that I was working within. And this is also really important to see what are things that exist right now, right? Like, what are people using at the moment? Does anything else solve this need? Not just to immediately jump in and kind of just like say, well, it doesn't exist. So I looked at 3 different games and kind of, you know, compared, contrasted, saw how they kind of laid next to my idea. And they all kind of like solved a little bit of what I was trying to do, but not completely. So the first game was about a very, very specific small focus. And the middle one was actually more of an ad than a game. It's by Trojan. And it's basically Cards Against Humanity, but add in some like sex jokes. Like, what does that sound coming from the bedroom? Flesh wrestling? Ew. And so it kind of treats it as like a taboo or kind of like gross in a way. And so I was kind of like, I don't want to do that with my game. Like, I don't want my game to make people uncomfortable. I want them to feel comfortable talking about this subject. And the third wasn't very interactive at all. It was really just like a game where you pressed the spin again button, and that was all that happened. And it was just kind of a roulette game. So I wanted something that was quite interactive. And I wanted something that was longer and got people more involved and had them hopefully attach themselves to a character. So I decided to create a curriculum that was a kind of multi-step process. And so in total, there's like 6 different topics that you cover. And these are actually aligned with the curricula that I reviewed in order to make a game about this comprehensive according to the sex education standards in the United States. So I went through, just compared all these things, took out the points that were kind of required, and then I also looked at things that survey participants had asked for amongst the 160 people. So, for example, things like, well, what do other people do that I can't do? And things like that, to just kind of make sure that I was also answering those other questions that people go and Google. And then afterward, I threw together some ideas based on my research again, kind of created some possible mechanics. Like the one you see here is actually you're dropped into a world and you kind of go around helping people, and the whole idea is that you kind of go through and resolve relationships like that. But that one didn't work out very well. I just didn't understand how you would get dropped in. I don't know if anyone's played Klonoa, but there's this very old game called Klonoa where you fall into this dream and you just kind of go around helping people, and I felt like it was basically a clone of Klonoa, so it didn't work out. But I did stumble upon, while I was ideating, this idea of doing text messaging. And I liked this idea so much when I write it down throughout my process that I actually decided to prototype it. And it was great because it aligned with my whole theory of like young people and communication and using cell phones, and we use messaging all the time, right? So why not have people message characters in the game? That way you can have like this whole arc of building a relationship with people who are in the game. And these characters aren't, real human beings. They don't. They have a fixed number of replies because this was again a thesis project, and you don't want to do something that's so ridiculous that you can't finish it. That's another important thing. Always remember to finish your projects, please. So in the game, characters actually react to your responses, and of course, because there's a fixed number of replies you can give, there's a fixed number of responses, but based on your responses over time, things could change within the game, and I thought that could be very, very cool, and I've seen lots of games that, kind of draw people in through those kinds of interactions, so I said, let's try it out, but I need a story first. Well, my demographic is in college. Let me think about college for a second. Resident advisors. I hope they have resident advisors here, but if they don't, I will explain what they do. So resident advisors actually stay within college dorms, and they advise their peers, so they're actually also students. And so they stay in the same dorms as the other students, but they also are kind of like these guidance figures who get trained to resolve interpersonal problems and things like that. But this was a hypothesis because I was never actually an RA. I had a couple of friends who were RAs, but I really wanted to confirm that this was plausible. And I also wanted to gather more research so that I could accurately portray the experience of an RA. So of course, more research, a lot of research. So I did a survey again, and if you can't notice, Google's surveys and all these other kinds of tools, people will answer if you ask, which is awesome. So I asked people for a lot of help, and they definitely delivered. So 40 people in this case responded to the survey, and I asked them things like, how long were you an RA? What subjects did you talk to people about? What subjects did you learn about? And people told me things like, oh, we focused a lot on interpersonal relationships. Like most of what they covered in their daily interactions with people were things like interpersonal relationships, time management, and other kinds of things related to that. The other thing that was really cool is that my mechanic was actually confirmed as something that was plausible. So outside of in-person communication, over 60% of resident advisors were communicating with people through things like text or email, so digital communication, which was awesome. So I was like, now that I know this is working and that people will be like, yeah, this is how RAs function, I was like, let's go. Let's actually start building this stuff. So what I did is I had my prototype, right? So I looked at my prototype, I drew some things out, and then I started building it in Phaser to kind of figure out what the architecture was. So shout out to Phaser. So I'm a really big fan of JavaScript, and that's personally what I use because it functioned for me, but obviously use whatever works for you when you're working on a project. So what I did was I built out the basic architecture, and once I had the architecture done, I actually started focusing on what the visual design could look like because I had some goals around this too, and I know that visual design can affect the way people interact with my project. So I had some goals which were, having the colors feel inviting, help people feel comfortable through those colors. Also, since the mechanic is messaging, I really wanted to make sure that it felt kind of like an app in a way, so that it was more immersive when they were using the messaging part. And I also wanted the interaction to feel as realistic as possible. And that's because even though people aren't talking to real human beings, they're talking to characters, I wanted them to feel like they were actually conversing with other human beings. So the result is a game that, because it's made in JavaScript, I can basically port it anywhere. I can put it on the web, I can have it on apps, or I can make it into an app and then have it on phones. That's what I meant. And it's called SenseU, which is named after the word sensuality. I'm a very cheesy person and I make puns. That's why I'm wearing this shirt that says catastrophe. And in the game, SenseU is actually an acronym for the university that the main character attends. So the game itself still has the messaging part in it, but in order to also craft a story around the messaging interface, I also created this narrative kind of interface where you again make lots and lots of choices. So throughout the game, you're kind of building a feeling that you are this character and that you're interacting with these people, that you know the environment that you're in. This was my hypothesis though. So what I did next was I actually started sharing it with people, and I started getting feedback. So I tested it multiple times. I brought it to different things and just asked people, can you try this out and tell me what you think? I also tested it with some of my fellow students, and I got lots and lots of feedback that came from them. So these are just a couple of the people that I asked, and I asked a lot of questions around things like, what's your occupation, or how do you feel about the game? How do you feel about the interface? Do you think things could be added or removed? And this really helped me to improve the game and not just work based on my assumptions. So I heard things like, the texting interface is cool. The color scheme is very soothing, so I was like, yes, success. And then they also said it felt like I was interacting with someone, like for real, which was amazingly exciting because these are just things that I was writing. I was writing these characters, I was designing all of the interactions, I was building all of these things, and so I really was hoping that I was doing the right thing. And to see something like this, it took a while actually. There were several iterations before someone said something like that, but it was very, very exciting for me. And it made me understand that I was moving in the right direction. So the demo is done, but the work is still not done on this game. This is a forever project, and the fun thing, at least in the US, about these kinds of projects, especially social good, it depends on how you build it and how you market it, but funding can be kind of iffy. So this is more of a side project for me, but it's not impossible for someone to actually fund a social good project as a note. So I'm going to keep building this out. I'm going to add more interactions to make it feel hopefully more immersive, maybe add more imagery to keep people engaged during the narrative parts, modify the writing and find a balance that feels a little bit less extreme so that people can feel like they are the main character. And these are all things you kind of test out, so that's why you got to keep doing more testing as you add things in or change things. And then I also want to explore partnerships because this isn't my field of expertise, right? Throughout this process, I definitely met with different people, sex educators, I met with various researchers, and things like that. And that's something to continue exploring afterward, actually continuing to meet with those teachers and those groups. So now, you know my process, right? I want to share some things that I learned with you because that's why you're all here, that's why I'm all here. Well, I'm one person. I'm all here. So, firstly, be humble, right? Technology is awesome, but honestly, like I told you what I can do, right? I can design, I can program, I can do some research, but I need to ask people for help, right? My skill set is actually quite limited, and at first I was like, yeah, I can do everything, but really, really quickly you start to realize maybe you can't do everything, and maybe that's okay. It's okay to not be able to make everything possible by yourself. It's honestly how being human works. There's only a limited amount of space in our brains at any one time, and yes, you can forget a little bit of one thing or focus on one thing for a while and not remember something for a while. You can go back to that other thing and remember that thing, but our skill sets are kind of limited at any one point. There is always more that you can learn though, but again, resources, yay. Secondly, try not to assume things. So as you heard me mention a lot, when I had assumptions, I framed them as hypotheses, and then I worked to test those kinds of things and really make sure that I wasn't just coming into it with my own biases. And it's really important to actually acknowledge the things that you assume up front before you begin your project, because if you don't, that will really heavily affect the solution that comes out of it. And say that you're working on a project for other people that aren't you, like that you don't have the experience of. How can you do that, with your assumptions? How do you know what they're actually feeling or thinking or needing if you're just going into it saying, well, this is what it looks like? You have to actually acknowledge that, and then you can work to change it by doing research. So before, during, after, you really need to make sure, like maybe your target audience isn't even the right audience. How do you know if you're not doing that research to find out? And if books or research papers don't yield anything, try, doing your own empirical research. As you saw, if you ask, people will gladly give you information. It's even better if you compensate them. So, next, design using data. Once you've done your research and you've, kind of looked at your assumptions and confirmed or removed them, you can actually think about the who, the what, the when, the where, the why, and define the how from all of that. So as I mentioned before, I didn't actually say what I was going to make until I looked at all the other stuff that I need to look at first and understand who I was trying to make this for, the context it was going to be within, like all of that stuff. So, ask yourself things like, does it really even need to be an app? Can it be some other kind of thing? I only settled on mobile because firstly, there were constraints around it, but also because I knew that young people use phones a lot. So make sure there are reasonings behind these things and that you're making design decisions based on some kind of concrete information. Next, if possible, embed yourself. So as I mentioned, I talked to some educators while I was working on this project. Try to interact with your target audience as much as possible. Partner with those who also interact with them because, again, they're closer than you are. So I talked to teachers, and they helped me to understand where students would be within the process of, going into adulthood and what was the better group to target with my first version of my game versus if I did other versions and all of those kinds of things. Additionally, make sure to actually listen, so when you talk to these kinds of people, when you embed yourself, when you're getting feedback from people, make sure to actually, pull that research in or that information and figure out how you can integrate it into your project. Obviously, grain of salt. Sometimes people aren't always right, and maybe they'll say, wow, put lasers in that. And it's like, maybe I shouldn't put lasers in this. This has nothing to do with lasers. But it's important to consider it when possible. And it's really important, especially as I mentioned, to open your ears even more if this is a group that is not your own that you're designing for, which happens all the time. I'm not a musician per se. I love jamming, but when I'm at SoundCloud, I'm designing for people sometimes who are creators and who are musicians. And so I really try hard to listen to what they're saying because it's not directly my expertise. Also, ask for help. So if you, acknowledge man, I just don't have the skill set to do all of these things, that is okay. You have to ask other people. And people will support you, So for example, when I asked for survey responses, people by droves were willing to answer. I didn't really expect that. The nice thing was that people understood that my project was something that was quite rare, so this came back to identifying a need and finding something that people really wanted in the world. And they were just willing to go out of their way and just kind of fill this thing in. So if you get people excited about it, they will do it. Additionally, I also don't know how to do music, as I mentioned, and this is a game, and games are better with sound, generally. And so I had to ask for help from a musician to actually make this game sound better and to feel more immersive and interactive. And I also realized that I can't do all of the art by myself if I'm also doing the coding and the designing and the writing. Not really possible. So I had to relinquish a little bit of art control, and sometimes that's what you have to do. You need to ask for help, because if you don't, then you're just going to push yourself until you just can't function. Additionally, test often, right? So make sure that your project is usable, make sure that you're reaching the right people, and you really need to make sure that you're testing those assumptions. You can identify them as hypotheses, but make sure you confirm them before actually moving forward. Focus on augmentation. So instead of expecting your project to shift the way society works by itself, focus on actually allowing it to augment human efforts, because technology needs people to work and it can't catch on by itself. Like, look at Ello, for example. People said, yeah, that's a new social media network that doesn't have ads. People are going to go there immediately. Nobody really went, and now nobody really remembered. Does anyone remember Ello? No? Rest in peace. One person. All right. So, as you can see, you really need human beings to be involved with this process. Technology can help, but it can't be the sole, focus. We have to also acknowledge that people really matter when it comes to these things, especially social change, right? And finally, accept the slower pace. So we're very used to instant gratification, but social change takes a lot of time. I acknowledged when I started this project, right, that this is something that's been going on for centuries, and that really helped me to say, this is going to take generations. This can help a little bit, but it's not going to solve all of the problems. And that's because you have to remember that people are coming into their daily lives with influences from various different things: society, their family, generations, and social change takes a long time to be implemented. So a lot of the times people say, like, oh my God, it's 2016. How is this still happening? And that's because, like I said, biases and different things, activities, all of these things take generations to change, and it takes a lot of effort and a lot of work. So you have to acknowledge that this is not one of those instant gratification kinds of things. It's going to be a longer term project, and you kind of have to be okay with that. So, to wrap up, tech requires people to work, right? Without adoption, these solutions are not going to stick. A solution isn't always the right one, and solutions without fail-safes may have very awkward or disastrous effects. Therefore, you really have to make sure you're testing your work so that you know that it's taking the right form. Also, privilege is everywhere in the work we do, right? We assume that people use the same technologies as us. We assume people have the same internet speeds as us. And we often solve problems that we feel are important. But you have to kind of acknowledge this and figure out what are ways that you can kind of, deal with that or push that away or, work outside of those biases and your assumptions. So, some advice to remember as you go off and, build really cool stuff, I hope, is firstly, do your research, do it beforehand, do it during the project, do it afterward. That can involve things like testing, reading, just asking people. Just make sure you're getting a lot of information. Also, embed yourself with people who you're, going to be creating this thing for, whether that's just doing some tests with them or whether that's interviewing them, if that's kind of sitting with them for a while every day. Make sure that you actually know who that audience is and you can identify them. Truly listen to your target audience, especially if they are not you, because their feedback should affect your work. And of course, grain of salt, right? Like, they're not always right, but it's good to make sure that you hear those concerns. And finally, accept that change takes time. Focus on assisting that process of change and use tech for its strengths, things like awareness and communication. And that is basically it. So hopefully you can build some cool things. Remember, tech isn't always awesome, but if you use it the right way, it can be actually quite cool. Thank you.